After being turned away by dealer after dealer who laughed and called his old tractor scrap, a desperate old man trying to raise money for his sick wife returned home with nothing but rejection, until one person took a closer look and uncovered something unbelievable. And just days later, at an auction filled with the very same dealers who mocked him, that worthless machine stunned everyone as its value climbed higher and higher, finally selling for an astonishing $11.5 million, changing his life forever. His name was Walter Briggs. He was 76 years old, and 3 weeks before that auction changed everything, he was sitting in a plastic chair at the medical center in Cedar Falls, Iowa, listening to a cardiologist explain that his wife's heart was giving out. "The valve is deteriorating," the doctor said, pointing at a scan on the monitor. "If we don't intervene surgically within 2 to 3 months, the heart will continue to weaken significantly." June Briggs sat beside Walter with her hands folded in her lap. 74 thin silver hair pinned neatly back. She wore the blue cardigan she'd owned longer than she could remember, and she looked at the scan and nodded once. "What kind of surgery?" Walter asked. "Valve replacement. There's a team at the University Hospital in Iowa City. They specialize in this procedure, and they're among the best in the country." "And our insurance?" The doctor paused. Walter had spent a lifetime reading pauses. Mechanics paused before quoting a price they knew was too steep. Bankers paused before explaining why the loan was denied. Doctors paused before delivering the part that would keep you awake at 3 in the morning. "Your plan covers the standard procedure," the doctor said carefully. "But given the severity, I'd strongly recommend the specialized surgery. The success rate is substantially higher. Unfortunately, your insurance classifies it as elective." "What does that mean in dollars?" "Out of pocket, roughly $180,000. The number dropped into the room and just sat there. A clock on the wall ticked. Down the hall, a phone rang. Walter's pension was $1,400 a month. June drew $900 from Social Security. They had $1,100 in the bank, and that was every cent of it. The savings had been drained when the roof collapsed after the ice storm, and the furnace had eaten whatever came after that. "There are financing options," the doctor said, "and programs that might—" "Thank you," Walter said. "We'll look into all of it." In the parking lot, Walter opened the passenger door for June and waited while she lowered herself in. He walked around, got behind the wheel, and started the engine. They sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield at nothing. $180,000, June said quietly. Walter pulled out of the lot. They drove west through the flat November countryside. Harvested cornfields stretched to the horizon, brown stubble and frozen dirt. The sky was low and white. "We'll appeal the insurance decision," Walter said. "There has to be a process for that." "Walter?" And the doctor mentioned an assistance program. "Some kind of financial, Walter." She put her hand on his arm. "Just take me home." So he did. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel driveway off the county road, 8 miles outside of town. White clapboard, 2 stories, built by Walter's grandfather Emmett in 1923. The porch sagged on the east end. The kitchen window had a crack Walter kept meaning to fix. He made coffee. June sat at the table. They drank it across from each other the way they had every morning for over half a century. Most days, the silence between them was easy. Today it had weight. "I'm going to make a list," Walter said. June looked up. "Of what we own. What might be worth something." "Walter, don't. Just to see where we stand." He set his mug down. "The truck might bring $5,000 if I'm lucky. The riding mower, $300. Your mother's china. You are not selling my mother's china. I'm just writing things down, June." She stared at him. That same quiet stubbornness that had held them together through every hard winter and empty bank account they'd ever faced. "And the tractor," he said. June set her mug down slowly. "Emmett's tractor. It's the most valuable thing on this property. An antique that old has to be worth something to a collector. Your grandfather drove that machine home from the factory where he worked. Your father grew up watching him drive it. You used to climb up on the seat when you were 6 years old and pretend you were plowing the back 40. I remember. You don't sell what your grandfather left you." Her voice was firm. "Not for me, not for anything." Walter looked at her across the table. 52 years they'd been married, and she had never once asked him for a single thing. When money was short, she stretched it. When he lost the job at the plant, she took a cashier position at the grocery store without one word of complaint. When their son Danny moved to Minneapolis and stopped returning calls, she cried once, quietly in the bedroom, and got up the next morning and made breakfast. Now she was dying, and she was telling him not to sell a tractor. "Promise me you'll try the insurance first," she said. "I promise." The appeal took 4 days. Walter called the insurance company, sat on hold for nearly 2 hours, got bounced between 3 departments, and finally reached a woman who told him in a polite, measured voice that the decision had already been reviewed and was final. The standard procedure was covered. The specialized surgery was not. "Is there anyone else I can talk to?" Walter asked. "I'm sorry, Mr. Briggs. I truly am." He hung up and stood at the kitchen window looking at the barn. The next morning, he borrowed a flatbed trailer from a neighbor down the road and spent most of the day winching the tractor out of the barn and onto the bed. The machine was heavy and stubborn, locked in place after decades of sitting still. Rust had welded the wheels to the floor. The winch cable slipped twice before Walter figured out the right angle. By the time the tractor was loaded, his back was screaming and his knuckles were split open and bleeding. June watched from the porch. She didn't say a word. "I'll be back by dinner," Walter told her. She nodded and went inside. The first place he tried was a farm equipment shop on the highway south of town. A young salesman came out and looked at the tractor on the trailer. He pulled out his phone and took a couple of photos. "How old is it?" the kid asked. "Around 1918? The kid called over an older man from the shop. The mechanic walked around the trailer once, touched the rusted wheel hub, and shook his head. "200, the mechanic said. "Scrap weight." $200, Walter said. "Metal's worth about that. Can't resell something like this. Nobody wants a tractor that old unless it runs. And from the look of it, this one stopped running before either of us was born." Walter thanked him and left. The second dealer was 15 miles east, a smaller operation run by a stocky man in a canvas work jacket. The man looked at the tractor from the doorway of his shop without walking all the way out. "150, the man said. "If you haul it here yourself." "It's 100 years old," Walter said. "Has to have collector value." Collector value is for things people want to collect. This is a barn ornament. 150's the offer. Walter drove on. A third dealer, another 10 miles down the highway, shook his head before Walter could finish his first sentence. "Can't help you," the man said. "Try a scrapyard." By late morning, Walter had been to 3 dealers and heard the same answer 3 different ways. There was one more place to try, and it was the one he'd been putting off. Calhoun Equipment sat on a sprawling lot on the north end of town. Glass showroom, polished concrete floors, new combines lined up on the lot with price tags deep into 6 figures. It was the biggest operation in 3 counties, the kind of place that smelled like new tires and money. Ray Calhoun came out himself, mid-50s, tan even in November, wearing a polo shirt with the dealership logo stitched on the chest. He shook Walter's hand with a grip designed to establish who mattered. "What can I do for you?" Ray said, already glancing past Walter towards something more interesting. "I've got an antique tractor to sell, around 1918. Been in my family since my grandfather brought it home from a factory." Ray looked through the showroom windows at the trailer in the lot. "That what you've got loaded up out there?" "Yes, sir." They walked outside. Ray circled the trailer with his hands in his pockets. Walter watched his face and saw exactly what he expected. The slight raise of the eyebrows, the fast dismissal of the rusted wheels, the seized engine block, the cracked seat leather. Ray exhaled sharply, almost a laugh. "Mr. Briggs, I appreciate you making the trip out here, but this isn't sellable equipment. This is an expensive pile of rust." "It's over 100 years old," Walter said. "That has historical value. Historical value is what people say when something has no actual value." Ray crossed his arms. "Look, I could do 300, and I'd be doing you a favor. I'd pay to have it hauled and then pay again to scrap it." 2 men from the service bay had wandered over to watch. One leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded. The other was grinning, whispering something to the first. 300, Walter said. "That's the market, friend. This thing isn't worth the diesel it'd take to haul it across town. My advice? Leave it where it is. Save yourself the trouble." Ray waited, his expression polite and final. The service bay men watched. Walter had spent his whole life working, fixing other people's equipment, crawling under other people's trucks, making other people's machines run again for modest pay and a handshake. He'd never asked for charity. He'd never missed a day. And now, when it mattered more than it had ever mattered, the most anyone would give him for the last thing he owned was $300. His wife needed $180,000, and the world was telling him his grandfather's legacy was scrap. "Thank you for your time," Walter said. He drove home the long way, through the county roads that threaded between fields his family had known for generations. He didn't turn on the radio. When he pulled into the driveway, he sat behind the wheel with the engine off for a long time. The porch light was on. June had turned it on for him. Half a century together, and she still turned on the porch light every time he left. He went inside. "Any luck?" June asked from the stove. She didn't turn around. "Not today," Walter said. She nodded. "Sit down. Soup's ready." They ate at the kitchen table, potato soup, her mother's recipe. Walter ate without tasting it. June watched him and didn't push. A knock came at the door halfway through dinner. Ruth from across the road stood on the porch holding a covered dish. "Made extra casserole," Ruth said, peering past Walter at June. "How are you doing, honey?" "Fine, Ruth," June said, smiling. "Come sit." Ruth stayed for 20 minutes. She talked about the weather turning cold, her granddaughter's school play, the new stoplight they were putting in on Main Street. She didn't mention doctors or money or anything heavy. She just sat at the table and filled the room with something warm enough to push back the cold for a while. After Ruth left, Walter washed the dishes. June touched his arm as he passed her chair. "It'll work out," she said. "I don't know how yet, but it will." Walter leaned down and kissed the top of her head. Then he pulled on his jacket and went outside. The air was sharp enough to sting. Stars covered the sky, thick and bright in the way they only got this far from any city light. His breath clouded in front of him as he crossed the yard. The barn door scraped when he shoved it open. He hit the switch, and the single overhead bulb flickered on. The tractor sat in its corner, right where he'd unloaded it that afternoon. Cobwebs hung from the exhaust stack to the rafters. A century of dust coated the seat. Walter dragged the old milk crate over and sat beside the machine. He put his hand on the fender. The metal was cold. "I tried, Emmett," he said quietly. "Took her to every place I could find. Nobody wants what you left me." He ran his fingers along the engine housing, over the rivets and bolt heads, feeling a century of use under his fingertips. His grandfather used to tell him stories about this tractor when Walter was small. How Emmett had worked at an engine factory in Waterloo. How the company changed hands and they gave him this machine. How he drove it home on a summer evening across 12 miles of dirt road. Walter had heard those stories dozens of times, but he'd been a kid, and kids don't ask the questions that matter. Which factory? What company? Why did they give it to you? What made this one worth keeping? Emmett had been gone since Walter was 40. The answers went with him. All Walter had were the stories and the machine sitting in front of him, and neither one seemed to be worth a thing. He sat there a long while. Wind pushed against the barn walls. A mouse scratched somewhere in the hayloft. The bulb overhead hummed its low, steady hum. He was about to stand up and go inside when his hand, resting near the base of the engine housing, caught on a ridge in the metal. A small bump he'd never noticed, hidden under decades of caked-on grime and rust. Walter leaned down and scraped at it with his thumbnail. Under the dirt, he felt the edge of a metal plate bolted to the frame, small, maybe 2 inches by 3. He went to the workbench and came back with a wire brush. Kneeling on the dirt floor, he worked at the plate carefully, watching brown flakes of corrosion fall away. Letters appeared under the rust, hand-stamped, each one uneven, punched individually with a hammer and a steel die, not machine-pressed. Hand-done, he could make out a W, then a B, then what looked like a dash and a P. The rest was buried under corrosion, too thick for a wire brush. He'd need solvent, better light, steadier hands. Walter sat back on his heels and looked at the tractor. In the weak glow of the barn light, with its peeling paint and seized engine and rusted-through wheel rims, it looked like what every dealer had told him it was, worthless. But Walter Briggs had spent a lifetime under the hoods of broken machines, and if he'd learned one thing in all those years, it was that the surface never tells you the whole story. You have to look deeper. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty and keep going when everyone else has already walked away. He put his hand on the fender one more time. "What are you hiding?" he said. He came back to the barn at first light with a bottle of rust solvent and a clean rag. The air was freezing, his breath visible in the dim glow of the overhead bulb. He knelt beside the tractor and worked the solvent into the metal plate, letting the chemical eat at the corrosion while he rubbed with the rag. More letters emerged. WB, then a dash, then P. After that, 3 digits that might have been 001. The stamping was deep, each character punched by hand, not rolled off a factory press. Walter stared at it. The letters meant nothing to him. Could have been an inventory tag, a factory code, some foreman's shorthand from a century ago. He wiped the plate clean and sat back. Whatever it was, it didn't change the fact that 4 dealers had looked at this tractor and seen scrap. He covered the plate with his thumb, feeling the grooves of the stamped letters. Then he stood up, turned off the light, and went inside to make June her breakfast. The days that followed were bad ones. June tried to hide it, but Walter could see her getting worse. She'd pause at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing, waiting for her breath to come back. She'd sit down in the middle of folding laundry and close her eyes. Small things that added up to something big and terrifying. On Wednesday, Walter put an ad in the county paper, antique tractor for sale, circa 1918, serious inquiries only. He listed his phone number and waited. The first call came that evening from a man who wanted to know if it ran. No, Walter said. It hasn't run in decades. The man hung up. The second call was the next morning. A woman asked if Walter could send photographs. He described it as best he could, and she said she'd think about it. She never called back. The third call came from a man in Des Moines who said he collected antique farm equipment and was very interested. Walter's heart lifted for the first time in days. "What are you asking?" the man said. "I was hoping to get it appraised first. See what it's worth." "I'll save you the trouble," the man said. "I can do $500 cash, if you deliver it." $500. Walter closed his eyes. "I'll think about it," he said. "Don't wait too long. That's a fair offer for something in that condition." Walter hung up and sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. On Thursday afternoon, June collapsed. Walter heard the sound from the living room, a glass hitting the kitchen floor and then a soft thump that was worse than any crash. He found her on the linoleum beside the counter, conscious but pale, her hand pressed to her chest. "I'm fine," she said before he could speak. "I just got dizzy." "You're not fine," he knelt beside her and took her wrist. Her pulse was fast and uneven. "Walter, don't call an ambulance. The bill alone would stop talking about bills." His voice came out sharper than he intended. He softened it. "Just breathe. Slow breaths." Ruth appeared at the back door 10 minutes later. She'd seen Walter's truck in the driveway at an unusual hour and came to check. She took one look at June on the floor and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the clinic," Ruth said. "Don't argue with me, June." The doctor saw her that afternoon. Her blood pressure was dangerously low. The valve was failing faster than the earlier scans had predicted. "We're running out of time," the doctor told Walter in the hallway while June rested in the exam room. "Months, not seasons. She needs that surgery." Walter nodded. His jaw was tight, his hands balled into fists at his sides. $180,000. He didn't have $180. He brought June home and settled her on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water. Ruth stayed through dinner, heating up the leftover casserole and keeping the conversation gentle. After Ruth left, June reached for Walter's hand. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking about what the doctor said. You're thinking about selling the tractor to that man in Des Moines for $500. Walter said nothing. $500 won't even cover one night in the hospital," June said. "Don't sell Emmett's tractor for pocket change. If you sell it for what it's worth." "Nobody thinks it's worth anything, June. Then maybe nobody's looked at it the right way." That was a Friday. On Saturday morning, a car Walter didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. A blue sedan, newer model with Iowa state plates. A woman got out, mid-30s. Dark hair pulled back, wearing a canvas jacket and boots that had actual mud on them. She carried a leather satchel over one shoulder. Walter was on the porch, replacing a rotted board. He set down his hammer and watched her approach. "Mr. Briggs," she called out. "Who's asking?" "My name is Clara Whitfield. I'm a research fellow at Iowa State in the Agricultural History Department." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm sorry to just show up. I tried calling, but the number in the county directory was disconnected. We changed it 2 months ago," Walter said. "Too many junk calls." Clara nodded. "I understand. Mr. Briggs, I've been visiting farms in the Waterloo area as part of a research project on early tractor manufacturing. I was at the county clerk's office last week, going through old employment records from the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company, and I came across the name Briggs. Walter's hand tightened on the porch railing. My grandfather, Emmett, worked at that company. Long time ago. That's what the records indicated. I was wondering if your family might still have any equipment or documents from that period. Walter studied her. She didn't look like a dealer. She didn't have the salesman's polish or the quick eyes that were already calculating a price. She looked like someone who'd driven a long way on a thin lead. "What exactly are you researching?" he asked. "The early production models of the Waterloo Boy tractor, specifically the prototypes that were built before John Deere acquired the company in 1918. Most of those machines were destroyed in a fire at the factory in 1919. My research suggests that a few might have survived, possibly taken home by workers before the fire." Walter was quiet for a moment. "I've got a tractor in the barn," he said. "Old one. My grandfather brought it home from a factory in Waterloo. That's about all I know." Clara's posture shifted. She stood a little straighter. "Would you be willing to let me see it?" Walter thought about Ray Calhoun, about the kid at the first shop and the man who wouldn't walk all the way to the trailer. He thought about the man from Des Moines offering $500. "It's just an old machine," Walter said. "4 dealers already told me it's scrap. I'm not a dealer, Mr. Briggs. I'm not here to buy anything. I just want to look." He led her across the yard to the barn. The door scraped open and the bulb clicked on, throwing its weak light across the dirt floor. The tractor sat in the far corner. Clara stopped just inside the door. She didn't move for several seconds. Then she set her satchel down on the floor and walked toward the tractor, slowly, her eyes moving over the frame. She circled it once without touching it. Then she came around again, closer this time, and crouched beside the engine housing. Her fingers traced the joint where the housing met the frame. "These welds," she said, almost to herself. "These aren't production line welds. These are hand-done." She moved to the cylinder head and examined it from underneath. "The casting marks are wrong. This isn't a standard Waterloo Boy cylinder. The bore is slightly wider and the fins are hand-finished." Walter leaned against the workbench and watched her. "What does that mean?" Clara didn't answer. She'd found the metal plate. She pulled a small flashlight from her jacket and shone it on the stamped letters. Her lips moved as she read. "What is a PP001? She read it again. Then she sat back on her heels and put her hand over her mouth. "Mr. Briggs," she said. Her voice had changed. "Where exactly did your grandfather get this tractor?" "I told you, the factory in Waterloo." "Do you know the circumstances? Was it purchased, or is it given to him?" Walter pulled up the milk crate and sat down. Emmett was a foreman at the engine company. Worked there for about 6 or 7 years. When the company changed hands, they gave him the tractor. A bonus, I guess, or a thank you. He drove it home and used it on the farm. That's the story he told my father, and that's the story my father told me. Clara was staring at the cereal plate. Her hands were trembling. "Miss Whitfield, are you all right, Mr. Briggs?" She looked up at him. "I think this might be the most important tractor in American history." Walter blinked. "Come again?" Clara stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. She took a breath, visibly steadying herself. In 1918, John Deere purchased the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company. That acquisition created John Deere's tractor division, which went on to become the foundation of the largest agricultural equipment company in the world. Before the sale, Deere sent a team of engineers to Waterloo to evaluate the company's products. They tested several machines, but there was one specific tractor, a hand-built prototype that was used as the primary demonstration model during the acquisition negotiations. She pointed at the serial plate. WBP001. Waterloo Boy, prototype, number 1. That's not a production serial number. Production models had 5-digit numbers starting in the 10,000s. This is a designation for a one-of-a-kind machine. Walter looked at the tractor, the same rusted, dust-covered, cobweb-draped machine he'd been staring at his entire life. After the acquisition went through, Clara continued, there was a fire at the Waterloo factory in 1919. Most of the pre-production equipment was destroyed. The prototype was listed as lost. Every historian who's written about John Deere's tractor division has noted that the original demonstration model was never recovered. She turned back to Walter. Because it wasn't in the factory when the fire happened. Your grandfather had already taken it home. Walter sat on the milk crate and didn't speak. The bulb overhead hummed. The wind pressed against the barn walls. "You're telling me this tractor is from the sale that created John Deere," he said slowly. "I'm telling you I think it might be. I need to bring in authentication experts to verify. There should be Deere inspection stamps on the frame members from when their engineers evaluated it. There may be other identifying marks. If this is what I think it is, Mr. Briggs, it changes everything we know about the Waterloo acquisition." "And what would something like that be worth?" Clara hesitated. "I don't want to speculate before authentication, but this isn't a question of hundreds or thousands of dollars." "What is it a question?" "Millions," Clara said. "Potentially." The words sat between them in the cold barn air. Walter looked at the tractor. He looked at Clara. He looked at his own hands, grease stains split at the knuckles from loading the same machine onto a trailer 3 days ago. "I'd like to bring 2 colleagues here to examine it," Clara said. "They're the leading authorities on pre-production Waterloo boy equipment. It would take a day or 2. They wouldn't move it or damage it. When? As soon as possible. Early next week, if that works." Walter nodded slowly. "All right, you can bring your people." Clara pulled a card from her satchel and set it on the workbench. "My phone number and email. Call me if you have any questions before then." She looked at the tractor one more time before she left. Her eyes were bright, and she kept clenching and unclenching her hands at her sides. Walter walked her to her car. She shook his hand, and her grip was firm, but her fingers were still trembling. "Mr. Briggs, I need you to understand something," she said before she got in. "If this is authenticated, it's one of the most significant finds in American agricultural history. It's not just a tractor. It's the machine that started everything." Walter watched her drive away. The blue sedan disappeared down the gravel drive, turned onto the county road, and was gone. He went back to the barn and sat on the milk crate. He looked at the tractor for a long time. That night, Clara sat in her motel room in Cedar Falls and called her mentor at the university. Her hands were still shaking. She'd stopped at a gas station on the way back to town and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, just breathing. "Kessler," she said when he answered, "I need you and Martin to come to Cedar Falls. I think I found the Waterloo boy prototype." Silence on the other end. "The one from the Deere acquisition," Kessler said. "Clara, that machine was destroyed in the 1919 fire." "It wasn't. It was in a barn 8 miles outside of town. The original owner's grandson has been sitting next to it his whole life without knowing what it was." More silence. "I saw the serial plate," Clara said. "WB P001, hand-stamped. The welds are hand-done, the cylinder bore is non-standard, and the casting marks don't match any production model in the registry. Dr. Kessler, I've spent 2 years looking for this machine. I'm looking at photographs of it right now. We'll be there Monday," Kessler said. Clara hung up and set the phone on the nightstand. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. Her grandfather had been a farmer, wheat and soybeans, 60 acres outside of Ames. He died when Clara was 23, 2 months before she'd started her graduate program. She'd always meant to sit down with him and record his stories, the ones about his father and grandfather and the machines they'd used to work the land. She kept putting it off. There was always next summer, next holiday, next visit. Then he was gone, and the stories went with him. Just like Emmett's stories had gone when he died. Clara picked up her phone and looked at the photographs again. The rusted green frame, the hand-stamped plate, the face of a 76-year-old man who'd spent his whole life walking past a piece of history without knowing it. She was going to make sure this story didn't get lost. Back at the farmhouse, Walter sat at the kitchen table across from June. He'd told her everything. The serial plate, the woman from Iowa State, the Waterloo boy prototype, the fire, the words she'd used. Millions. June listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "What if she's wrong?" Walter said. "What if it's just an old tractor with a funny serial number and I've been sitting in that barn getting my hopes up over nothing?" June reached across the table and took his hand. "What if she's right?" she said. Her face was thin and pale, and her fingers were cold in his grip, but her eyes were steady. He squeezed her hand and held it. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. June's breathing beside him was shallow and uneven, the rhythm of a heart that was running out of time. Monday was 2 days away. Clara's experts would come, and they'd look at the tractor, and they'd either confirm what she believed, or they'd shake their heads and tell him it was nothing. 2 days. Walter stared at the dark ceiling and waited. Clara's blue sedan pulled into the driveway at 8:15 on Monday morning. Behind her came a silver SUV with two men inside. Walter was already on the porch, coffee in hand, watching them park. Clara made the introductions on the gravel. Doctor. Kessler was in his 60s, tall and lean, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful posture of a man who'd spent his career leaning over museum exhibits. His colleague was younger, maybe 40, with a trimmed beard and a heavy equipment case in each hand. "Thank you for agreeing to this, Mr. Briggs," Kessler said, shaking Walter's hand. "Clara's been telling us about your tractor, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't sleep much last night." "That makes two of us," Walter said. He led them to the barn. The door scraped open, the bulb clicked on, and there it was. The same rust and cobwebs and cracked seat Walter had been looking at his whole life. Kessler stopped just inside the doorway. He stood there for a full 10 seconds without moving. Then he turned to Clara. "You weren't exaggerating," he said quietly. They worked all day. Kessler and his colleague moved around the tractor with the slow precision of surgeons, examining every weld, every bolt, every seam in the frame. They used magnifying lenses and small LED lights. They took photographs from every angle. They measured the cylinder bore with a caliper and compared the numbers to a reference book that Kessler had brought, its pages flagged with dozens of colored tabs. Walter sat on the milk crate and watched. June came out around noon with sandwiches and coffee, and the men ate without taking their eyes off the machine. "The cylinder bore is wider than any production, Waterloo boy on record," Kessler said, pointing with a pen, "by about 3 millimeters. That's consistent with a hand-matching prototype where the dimensions hadn't been finalized for mass production." His colleague was underneath the tractor on his back, shining a light at the underside of the frame. "I've got markings down here," he called out, "stamped into the crossmember. Looks like inspection codes." Kessler crouched down beside him. They both went quiet. "What is it?" Walter asked. Kessler looked up. His expression had shifted. "Mr. Briggs, these stamps are Deere Engineering inspection marks. They match the format used by John Deere's evaluation team during acquisition assessments in 1917 and 1918. I've seen this exact format in photographs from the company archives." Clara, standing near the door with her arms wrapped around herself, let out a long breath. They worked until dark. The next morning they were back at 7, and by Mita found what Kessler called the final piece. The colleague was examining the underside of the seat, which they'd carefully removed and set on a clean tarp. On the metal plate beneath it, hidden for over a century, were 3 sets of initials and a date stamped into the steel in the same hand-punched lettering as the serial plate. "RNW, JHD, TSB," Kessler read aloud. He looked at Clara. "Those are the initials of the 3 Deere engineers who conducted the Waterloo evaluation. Robert Norton, Wilmington, James Henry Drake, and Theodore Simon Barr. Their names are on the acquisition report filed with the John Deere Board of Directors in December 1917. He set down his magnifying glass and stood up slowly. "The date stamped here is October 15th, 1917, Kessler said. "That's consistent with the timeline. The evaluation team visited the Waterloo factory in October of that year. The acquisition was finalized in March of 1918. He turned to Walter. "Mr. Briggs, in my professional opinion, this is the Waterloo Boy demonstration prototype, the machine that was used to convince John Deere's board to purchase the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company. It is the single most significant artifact in the history of John Deere's tractor division, and it has been considered lost for over 100 years. Walter looked at the tractor, the same machine, same rusted fender he put his hand on 1,000 times. Same cracked seat Emmett had driven home across 12 miles of dirt. "You're sure?" Walter said. "I've spent my career studying these machines," Kessler said. "I've never been more sure of anything." The kitchen was warm and smelled like the coffee June had brewed. Walter and June sat on one side of the table. Clara, Kessler, and his colleague sat on the other. It felt like a meeting, and in a way it was. "I want to make sure you both understand what this means," Clara said, looking at Walter and June in turn. "This tractor is not worth what the dealers told you. It's not worth $500 or $300 or scrap weight." "Then what is it worth?" June asked. Her voice was steady, but her hand gripped Walter's under the table. "That depends on how you sell it," Kessler said. "A private sale to a museum or collector could bring several million. But an auction, a properly marketed auction with full authentication and media attention, could push the price significantly higher. "How much higher?" Walter said. Kessler and Clara exchanged a look. "There are only a handful of artifacts this important in American agricultural history," Clara said. "The John Deere Heritage Foundation would almost certainly bid. Private collectors with deep pockets would compete. Given the story, the provenance, the century it spent in your barn, I think we're talking about a final price well into 8 figures. 8 figures, Walter said. Tens of millions, Clara said. Potentially." June's grip tightened on Walter's hand. She didn't speak. Her eyes were filling, and she blinked hard and looked at the ceiling. Walter sat very still. His hands, grease-stained and split at the knuckles, lay flat on the kitchen table. These were hands that had earned $1,400 a month for decades. Hands that had fixed other people's machines and come home to a house with a cracked kitchen window. "What do we do?" he asked. Clara pulled a folder from her satchel. "I've taken the liberty of reaching out to a major auction house. They specialize in rare industrial and agricultural artifacts. If you're willing, they can handle everything: authentication paperwork, catalog listing, marketing the event itself. Their commission is standard. They've expressed significant interest." "How soon?" Walter said. "They have a scheduled event in 3 weeks. If we move quickly on the paperwork, they could add a special lot." Walter looked at June. She looked at him. 3 weeks, June said. "Can you wait 3 weeks?" Walter asked her. He meant her heart, and they both knew it. "I can wait 3 weeks. Over the next several days, the news leaked." Walter didn't know how. Maybe one of the experts mentioned it to a colleague. Maybe someone at the auction house talked. However it happened, by Wednesday the phone was ringing non-stop, and cars were slowing down on the county road to look at the farm. A reporter from the Cedar Falls Gazette called and asked for an interview. Walter declined. A television crew from Des Moines showed up at the end of the driveway, and Ruth came across the road and told them to leave. The talk spread through town fast. Walter heard secondhand that people at the feed store were discussing it, that the diner was buzzing with it, that his name was being mentioned in conversations he wasn't part of. And then he heard what Ray Calhoun was saying. Ruth told him. She'd been at the hardware store and overheard Ray talking to 2 other men near the register. He said it's a scam, Ruth told Walter, sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on. Said some university woman sold you a fairy tale. Said there's no way that pile of junk in your barn is worth anything and that you're going to embarrass yourself. Walter set his coffee mug down. He didn't say anything for a long time. "Let him talk," he said finally. "I know what the experts found." "I know you do," Ruth said. "I'm just telling you so you're not surprised." Walter wasn't surprised. Men like Ray Calhoun always knew the price of things. They just never knew the value. On Thursday of the following week, June had another bad spell. Walter found her sitting on the edge of the bed at 4 in the morning, breathing in slow, deliberate pulls, her hand flat on her chest. "How bad?" he asked. "Just tight," she said. "It passes." But it didn't pass fast enough. By morning, her lips had a blue tint that scared Walter more than anything he'd seen. He drove her to the emergency room and sat in the waiting area with his hands between his knees while they ran tests. The doctor came out an hour later. "She's stable," the doctor said, "but the valve is deteriorating rapidly. We're looking at weeks now, not months. The auction is in 9 days," Walter said. "I'd recommend scheduling the surgery as soon as possible after that." Walter called Clara from the hospital parking lot. His voice was flat and steady, but his hands were shaking. "I'm thinking about canceling the auction," he said. "Selling it private, taking whatever someone will give me today." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I understand, Mr. Briggs. I do. But a private sale under pressure will get you a fraction of what this is worth. The auction is 9 days away. The catalog is printed. Bidders are registered. If you sell now, you might get 2 or 3 million. At auction, it could be 5 times that. My wife might not have 5 times. Have you talked to her about it?" Walter drove back inside and sat beside June's bed. She was propped up on pillows, oxygen tube under her nose. She looked small in the hospital gown, but her eyes were clear. "I want to cancel the auction," he said. "No," June said. "June, Walter Briggs, you listen to me." She reached for his hand and held it tight. "We have waited this long. We can wait 9 more days. Do it right." He looked at her face. Thin and pale, but there was iron underneath it. The same iron that had held their family together for half a lifetime. Do it right, she said again. For Emmett, if you've made it this far into Walter's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The auction house sent a transport team 4 days later. 2 men in a specialized truck with air ride suspension and climate-controlled cargo. They brought a custom cradle built specifically for the tractor, padded with foam and secured with nylon straps, rated for 3 tons. Walter watched them work from the barn doorway. Clara stood beside him. They know what they're doing, Clara said. It'll be treated like a museum piece from here on out. Walter nodded. The men lifted the tractor with a hydraulic arm and set it gently into the cradle. No scraping, no banging, no carelessness. They handled it the way Walter had always believed it should be handled, like it mattered. Before they closed the cargo doors, Walter walked to the truck. He put his hand on the tractor's fender. One last time. Thank you, Emmett, he said quietly, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Then he stepped back, and the doors closed, and the truck pulled down the driveway and turned onto the county road. He watched until it disappeared. The barn felt different that evening. Walter stood in the doorway and looked at the empty corner where the tractor had sat for over a century. The concrete floor was darker there, outlined by decades of accumulated dirt and dust, a shadow of something that was no longer there. He pulled up the milk crate and sat in the empty space. His hand went to the pocket watch, Emmett's watch, that he wore every day. He turned it over in his fingers. 9 days, he said to the empty barn. Then we'll know. The night before the auction, Walter couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to June's breathing and watching the clock. 2:14, 2:37, 3:05. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ray Calhoun's face, the slight laugh, the crossed arms. The word that had followed Walter home and into the barn and into every sleepless hour since. Scrap. He got up at 4:30 and dressed in the dark. His one good suit, the charcoal one he bought for their son's college graduation and hadn't worn since. White shirt, dark tie. He polished his shoes at the kitchen table while the coffee brewed. June came down at 5:15. She was wearing the green dress she saved for important occasions, and she'd pinned her hair the way she used to wear it when they were young. You look beautiful, Walter said. You look like you haven't slept in a week, she said. That's because I haven't. She sat across from him and took his hand. Whatever happens today, she said, I need you to know something. You did everything you could. You tried every door. You never gave up. That's worth more than any number someone writes on a check. Walter held her hand and didn't trust himself to speak. At 6 o'clock, he helped June into the truck. Her portable oxygen unit sat between them on the bench seat. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. The sun was just coming up over the fields, turning the frost on the corn stubble golden white. The highway stretched south toward the city. Walter drove with both hands on the wheel, and June sat beside him with her eyes on the road ahead. The auction house was a converted warehouse on the south side of Des Moines, a brick building with tall windows and a parking lot that was already half full when Walter pulled in at 7:45. Media vans lined the curb. 2 camera crews were setting up near the entrance. Cars he didn't recognize, expensive ones, sat in reserved spots near the front. Walter parked at the far end of the lot and turned off the engine. He looked through the windshield at the building. That's a lot of people, he said. June adjusted her oxygen tube and smoothed the front of her green dress. Good. More people. More bidders. He got out and pulled the wheelchair from the truck bed. June had protested when he'd loaded it that morning. I can walk, she'd said. You can also sit, Walter had said. Pick the one that lets you stay through the whole auction. She'd gotten in the chair without another word. He wheeled her across the lot toward the entrance. People turned to look. A woman with a press badge approached and asked if they were the Briggs family. Walter said yes and kept walking. Clara was waiting for them inside the lobby, wearing a dark blazer and a nervous expression Walter hadn't seen on her before. How are you feeling? Clara asked June. Better than my husband, June said. He's the one who looks like he might pass out. Clara smiled. She turned to Walter. The room is full. Over 200 registered bidders, plus media and observers. The John Deere Heritage Foundation has a representative in the 3rd row. There's a collector from Dallas and another from London. Dr. Kessler is here as well. And, Walter said. Clara understood the question. Ray Calhoun is here. 6th row, right side. Walter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He gripped the wheelchair handles and followed Clara through the double doors into the auction hall. The room was cavernous, high-ceilinged with rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a raised platform. On the platform, under museum-grade lighting, sat the tractor. Walter stopped when he saw it. The rust was still there. The cracked seat, the seized engine, nobody had cleaned it up or polished away the century of wear. But under those lights set against a dark backdrop with the authentication documents displayed on a screen behind it, it looked different. It looked like what it was. June reached back and put her hand over Walter's. "There he is," she said softly. "Emmett's tractor." Walter wheeled her to the reserved seats in the front row. Clara sat beside them. The room hummed with low conversation, the sound of programs being opened and phones being silenced. He looked to his right. 6 rows back on the far side, Ray Calhoun sat in an aisle seat. He wore a sport coat and a tight expression. Their eyes met. Walter held the look. Ray glanced away first and studied his program. The other dealers were harder to spot, but Walter found them. The young salesman from the first shop, sitting near the back with a colleague. The stocky man in the canvas jacket standing against the wall. They'd come to watch, maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of disbelief, maybe because the man they'd turned away was about to prove them all wrong. At exactly 9 o'clock, the auctioneer stepped to the podium. He was a tall man in a dark suit with a voice that carried effortlessly across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Lot number 27 is the sole special lot of today's event, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most remarkable artifacts to come to auction in my career." He pressed a button and photographs filled the screen behind the tractor. The serial plate, the Deere inspection stamps, the engineer initials, the authentication certificates, signed by Kessler and his colleague. What you see before you is the 1917 Waterloo Boy prototype, serial designation WB-P001. This is the hand-built demonstration model used by the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company during John Deere's acquisition evaluation in the fall of 1917. The acquisition, finalized in March of 1918, created John Deere's tractor division, which became the cornerstone of the world's largest agricultural equipment manufacturer. He paused to let that land. This machine was believed to have been destroyed in a factory fire in 1919. It was not. It was preserved, unknowingly, by a single family in Cedar Falls, Iowa, for over a century. It has been authenticated by 2 of the foremost experts in pre-production Waterloo Boy equipment, and its provenance has been independently verified. The room was silent. Every seat was full. People stood along the walls. "We will open the bidding at $50,000. A paddle went up in the 3rd row almost before the auctioneer finished the sentence. Then another near the back, then 2 more. 50,000, 75, 100,000. Walter's hands were on his knees. June's hand found his. 100,000. The bid is 200,000. The numbers climbed quickly. It was hard to follow which paddle belonged to which bidder. The auctioneer's voice had taken on the rhythmic cadence of a man doing what he was born to do, eyes sweeping the room, catching each new bid the instant it appeared. 300,000, 350, 400,000, 450, 500,000, 500,000. Walter gripped June's hand. The stocky dealer against the wall uncrossed his arms and put them at his sides. The young salesman from the first shop was staring at the tractor with his mouth slightly open. 600,000. 7, 8, 900,000. The room buzzed. Bidders who had dropped out craned their necks to see who was still in. $1 million. Something shifted in the room when the auctioneer said it. A collective intake of breath. The number hung in the air and changed the temperature. 1,200,000. 1,005,000. 1,008,000. June squeezed Walter's hand so hard he could feel her pulse through her fingertips. $2 million. Clara leaned forward in her seat, her hands clasped between her knees. 2,500,000. 3 million. 3,005,000. The bidding was down to 4 paddles now. The others had dropped away, their limits reached. $4 million. Walter's chest was tight. He focused on breathing. The numbers were so far beyond anything he'd ever imagined that they'd stopped feeling real. They were just sounds the auctioneer was making. $5 million. June made a small sound beside him. He looked at her. Tears were running down her face, but she was smiling. 5,005,000. 6 million. 2 bidders left. The auctioneer slowed his cadence, giving each bidder time. The man from Dallas, a silver-haired collector in a tan suit, sat with his paddle resting on his knee. Across the aisle, a woman in a dark blazer, the representative from the John Deere Heritage Foundation, held her paddle at her shoulder. $7 million. The Dallas Collector. $7.5 million. The Heritage Foundation. $8 million. Dallas. He raised his paddle without hesitation. $8.5 million. Heritage Foundation, the woman consulted briefly with the man beside her, then nodded. $9 million. Dallas. He looked calm, unhurried. $9.5 million. Heritage Foundation. The room was utterly silent between bids. Walter could hear the hum of the lights above the tractor. $10 million. The Collector from Dallas. He raised his paddle slowly, deliberately. The room exhaled. $10.5 million. Heritage Foundation. The woman's face was composed, but her hand was tight on the paddle. A long pause. The auctioneer looked at Dallas. The bid is $10.5 million. Sir. $11 million, the Collector said. He didn't use the paddle, he just said it. The auctioneer turned to the Heritage Foundation representative. $11.25 million, the woman said. Back to Dallas. The Collector looked at the tractor on the platform. He looked at his associate. A brief conversation, too quiet to hear. $11.5 million, the Dallas Collector said. The Heritage Foundation representative consulted with her colleague. The room held its breath. She looked at the tractor for a long moment, then lowered her paddle and shook her head. Wait. The auctioneer paused. The room went still. Then the Heritage Foundation woman raised her paddle one final time. $11.5 million, she said clearly. The Dallas Collector studied her. 10 seconds passed. 20. The entire room watched him. He shook his head once and set his paddle on his knee. $11.5 million, the auctioneer said. Going once. Walter couldn't breathe. Going twice. June gripped his hand with both of hers. Sold. $11.5 million to the John Deere Heritage Foundation. The gavel came down, and the room erupted. Applause, standing ovations, camera flashes. The noise washed over Walter and through him. He stood up. His legs felt uncertain, and he braced himself on the back of June's wheelchair. June was crying openly, both hands pressed to her face. Clara had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming. Walter, June said, reaching for him. Her voice broke on his name. He knelt beside her wheelchair and pulled her close. She buried her face in his shoulder, and he held her while the room clapped around them. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that could match the moment. When they finally separated, Clara was standing nearby, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Congratulations," she said. Her voice was rough. "Clara," Walter said. He cleared his throat. "You should have a share of this. A finder's fee. Whatever they call it. You found what nobody else could see." Clara shook her head. "This was never about money for me. I came here looking for a lost tractor and I found it. That's enough." "It's not enough," Walter said. "You changed our lives. Your grandfather preserved it," Clara said. "You kept it safe. I just recognized what was already there." She shook his hand and then she hugged June carefully around the oxygen tube. "I'm going to write the definitive paper on this tractor," Clara said. "With your family's permission. Emmett Briggs deserves to have his name in the history books." "He'd like that," Walter said. People came to shake Walter's hand. The Heritage Foundation representative introduced herself and said the tractor would be restored and placed on permanent display. Dr. Kessler came forward and simply said, "Remarkable." Reporters asked for quotes, and Walter gave them short ones because long ones weren't in his nature. And then, in the hallway outside the auction room, Ray Calhoun was standing by the water fountain. Walter saw him first. Ray was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching the crowd file past. When Walter pushed June's wheelchair into the hallway, Ray straightened up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise from the auction room spilled through the open doors behind them. "Mr. Briggs," Ray said. He stepped forward. His face was hard to read. Something between embarrassment and something else, something that might have been grudging respect. "I owe you an apology." Walter looked at him. He thought about the showroom floor, the crossed arms, the service bay guys grinning, the word that had followed him home. "You told me it was scrap," Walter said. "I was wrong," Ray said. "You were wrong about a lot of things." Walter said it evenly, without heat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The numbers on the auction board behind them said everything that needed saying. Ray stood there for a moment, then he nodded, once, and walked away. June, from her wheelchair, watched him go. "You handled that well," she said. "I almost didn't." "But you did." She patted his arm. "Your grandfather would be proud. The auction house staff handled the paperwork. The commission was standard, the taxes would come later, and the net amount would be wired to an account that the auction house helped Walter set up that afternoon." Clara stayed through the whole process, translating legal language into plain English whenever Walter's eyes started to glaze. By 3 o'clock it was done. Walter wheeled June back to the truck, loaded the wheelchair, and sat behind the wheel. He didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, hands on the steering wheel, looking at the building where his grandfather's tractor had just sold for $11.5 million. "Walter," June said. He turned to her. "Call the doctor." He almost laughed. He did laugh, the first real laugh in weeks, a sound that surprised him and cracked something loose in his chest. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He pulled out his phone and called the cardiologist's office. He told the receptionist he needed to schedule the specialized valve replacement surgery for his wife, and that money was no longer a concern. The receptionist put him on hold. A nurse came on the line and asked a few questions. An appointment was set for the following Monday. Walter hung up and started the truck. June put her hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up. I was never going to give up on you," he said. They pulled out of the parking lot and onto the highway. The November sun was low and gold, stretching their shadows out behind them on the asphalt. June leaned her head against Walter's shoulder, and he drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding hers. "Your grandfather left you something special," June said softly. "I just didn't know how special." "Neither did I." The highway unrolled ahead of them, flat and straight, pointing north toward home. Walter drove, and June rested against him, and the fields on either side caught the late light and held it. The surgery took 7 hours. Walter sat in the waiting room at the University Hospital in Iowa City with a paper cup of coffee he never drank. Ruth had driven down from Cedar Falls to sit with him. She brought a thermos of soup and a paperback novel she didn't open. They sat together in the plastic chairs, not talking much, watching the clock on the wall mark the hours. At 4:17 in the afternoon, the surgeon came through the double doors. She was still in her scrubs, a mask hanging around her neck. "Mr. Briggs?" Walter stood up. His knees had gone stiff from sitting. "How is she?" "The procedure went well. The new valve is in place and functioning. She's in recovery now. Can I see her in about an hour? She'll be groggy, but you can sit with her." Walter nodded. He tried to say thank you, but the words caught in his throat. The surgeon seemed to understand. She put a hand on his shoulder briefly, then turned and went back through the doors. Ruth took his arm and guided him back to his chair. "Breathe," she said. Walter sat down and put his face in his hands. By springtime, June was walking in the garden again. It happened in stages. First, short trips from the bed to the chair by the window. Then laps around the upstairs hallway, leaning on Walter's arm. Then the stairs, one step at a time, with Walter behind her and his hand at the small of her back. Then the porch, then the yard, then the garden. She moved slowly and she tired easily, and some days were better than others. But the color came back to her face. Her appetite returned. She started humming while she folded laundry again, a thing Walter hadn't realized he'd missed until he heard it coming from the bedroom on a Tuesday morning and had to step outside for a minute to collect himself. The money had changed their circumstances, but Walter made sure it didn't change them. He paid the medical bills first. The surgery, the hospital stay, the rehabilitation, the follow-up appointments. He cleared the mortgage on the farm, a debt that had been with them so long. It felt like part of the foundation. He put aside enough to keep them comfortable for whatever time they had left, which, according to June's doctors, might now be a good deal longer than anyone had expected. Then he did the thing June had suggested one evening while they were sitting at the kitchen table, going through the financial advisor's paperwork. "There are other people like us," she'd said. "People in small towns who get sick and can't afford the treatment. People the insurance companies say no to. What are you thinking? A fund. Something with Emmett's name on it. For families who are where we were." So Walter set it up. The Emmett Briggs Medical Fund administered through the County Community Foundation. It covered emergency medical costs for rural families who couldn't afford treatment. No application process longer than 2 pages. No committee reviews that took months. If a family needed help and qualified, the money was there. The fund made the local paper, then the state paper. Then a wire service picked it up and Walter started getting phone calls from reporters and producers and people who wanted to put him on television to talk about the tractor and the auction and the fund and his grandfather. He said no to most of them. The attention made him uncomfortable. He hadn't sold the tractor to become famous. He'd sold it to save his wife. A few people came by the farm to shake his hand or bring a pie or just look at the spot where the tractor used to sit. Walter was polite, but he kept these visits short. He wasn't a story. He was a man who'd gotten lucky because his grandfather had been smart enough to bring a machine home from a factory. One afternoon in early May, he was in the barn replacing a broken hinge on the loft door when his phone rang. The number on the screen had a Minneapolis area code. Walter looked at it for 3 rings before he answered. "Dad?" The voice was familiar and distant at the same time. Danny, his son. The last time they'd spoken was Christmas, and that conversation had lasted less than 4 minutes. "Danny," Walter said, a long pause, "about the auction." "It's been a few months. I know. I should have called sooner." Walter leaned against the workbench and closed his eyes. There were things he wanted to say, things he'd rehearsed in his head on sleepless nights. About the holidays Danny hadn't come home for. About the phone calls that got shorter every time. About June's diagnosis and the months of fear and how Danny hadn't been there for any of it. But he'd lived long enough to know that anger doesn't fix what time is broken. And he'd spent the last half year watching June come back from something that should have killed her. Life was too short and too fragile to waste on keeping score. "I should have come home sooner," Danny said again. "You're calling now," Walter said. "That counts for something." Silence on the other end. Then Danny's voice, quieter. "How's Mom?" "She's good. Walking in the garden, eating real food. She's getting stronger every week." "And you?" "I'm all right, Danny." Another pause. Walter could hear traffic in the background. Danny was outside somewhere, maybe on a lunch break, maybe standing on a sidewalk working up the nerve to make a call he'd been putting off. "Mom called me when she got out of the hospital," Danny said. "I didn't answer. I saw the voicemail and I didn't know what to say. You don't always have to know what to say. Sometimes you just have to show up." Danny was quiet for a long time. "Can I come home?" he said. "Not to stay. Just for a weekend. To see you and Mom." Walter opened his eyes and looked at the empty corner of the barn where the tractor used to sit. "This is your home, Danny. The door's never been locked." After they hung up, Walter stayed in the barn for a while. He didn't know if Danny would actually come. He'd made promises before, but the call itself meant something, and Walter had lived long enough to know that doors don't open all at once. Sometimes they crack first, and you have to be patient with the crack. In June, the John Deere Heritage Foundation invited Walter and June to Moline, Illinois for the dedication ceremony. The Waterloo Boy prototype was going on permanent display at the John Deere Pavilion, and they wanted the Briggs family there for the unveiling. Clara drove him. She picked them up at 6 in the morning, and the 3 of them rode together through the Iowa countryside with the windows down and the early summer air filling the car. June sat in the back seat with a blanket on her lap, looking stronger than she had in months. Clara and Walter talked about Emmett, about the factory, about the century the tractor had spent in the barn without anyone knowing what it was. "I finished the paper," Clara said at one point. "It's been accepted for publication. Emmett Briggs is named throughout. He's in the historical record now." "He'd have gotten a kick out of that," Walter said. The pavilion was a modern building with high glass walls and polished steel beams. Inside, the exhibits traced the full history of John Deere, from the original steel plow to the latest precision agriculture systems. And now, in a central gallery, behind a glass enclosure with climate-controlled air and museum-grade lighting, sat Emmett's tractor. It had been carefully restored, not rebuilt, not repilt, not repainted, not made new. The restoration team had cleaned it and stabilized the metal and treated the rust, but they'd preserved every mark and scar and imperfection. The hand-stamped serial plate was visible and polished. The Deere inspection stamps on the frame were highlighted with small LED spotlights. The engineer initials under the seat were photographed and enlarged on a panel beside the display. A brass plaque read, "Waterloo Boy Prototype, 1917. Serial WB P Serial 1. Preserved by the Briggs family of Cedar Falls, Iowa for over 100 years. Gift of the John Deere Heritage Foundation. Walter stood in front of the glass and looked at the tractor. The same machine, same rivets, same frame. But it looked different here. It looked like what it had been all along, just waiting for someone to see it. Mr. Briggs. A woman in a dark suit approached him. She was a senior executive with the Heritage Foundation, and she shook his hand with both of hers. On behalf of the foundation and the Deere family, I want to thank you. Your grandfather preserved a piece of history that we believed was lost forever. We can never repay what your family has given us. Emmett didn't know what he had, Walter said. He just thought it was a good tractor. The executive smiled. Sometimes the most important things don't announce themselves. There was a short ceremony, a few speeches. Dr. Kessler spoke about the significance of the find. Clara spoke about the research trail that had led her to the Briggs farm. The executive spoke about what the Waterloo acquisition had meant for John Deere and for American agriculture. Then they asked Walter to say a few words. He stood at the podium and looked out at the small crowd. Foundation staff, museum curators, reporters, a few local officials. June sat in the front row with Clara beside her. I'm not much for speeches, Walter said. He looked at the tractor in its glass case. My grandfather, Emmett Briggs, was a factory foreman. He wasn't famous. He didn't invent anything or run a company. He showed up to work every day and did his job. And when it was time to go, they gave him a tractor and he drove it home. He used it on his farm until it stopped running, and then he parked it in the barn. And there it sat for 100 years while his son and his grandson walked past it every morning. Walter paused. 4 dealers told me that tractor was scrap. They looked at the rust and the dust and the flat tires, and they saw junk. But Clara Whitfield looked at the same machine and saw history. She looked deeper. She cared enough to try, and because she did, my wife got the surgery she needed, and my family has a future we never thought possible. He looked at June. I don't have anything wise to say about that. I'm a mechanic. I fix things. But I'll tell you what I know. The people who call something worthless are usually the ones who can't see past the rust, and the things that matter most don't always look like much from the outside. He stepped away from the podium. The room clapped. June was crying, but she was smiling through it, and that was enough. They drove home that evening. Clara dropped them off and hugged them both in the driveway and said she'd be back to visit in August. The next morning, a young man pulled into the driveway in a battered pickup truck. He was in his mid-20s, thin, wearing work clothes with grease stains on the knees. Walter was on the porch with his coffee. "Mr. Briggs," the young man called. "I'm sorry to bother you. I farm a piece of land about 10 miles south. My truck's been making a sound I can't figure out, and I can't afford a mechanic right now. Someone in town said you used to fix engines." Walter set his coffee down and walked to the truck. "What kind of sound?" "A grinding, kind of. Under the hood, on the right side." Walter popped the hood and leaned in. He listened. He put his hand on the engine block and felt the vibration. After about 30 seconds, he straightened up. "Your alternator bearing is going," he said. "I've got a spare in the barn that might fit. Let me take a look." He came back with a part and a toolbox and spent the next 40 minutes under the hood while the young man stood beside him and watched. "How much do I owe you?" The young man stood beside him and closed the hood. "Nothing. Mr. Briggs, I can't just—" "Your grandfather helped mine once," Walter said. He didn't know if it was true, but it was the kind of thing that was true enough. "That's how it works around here." The young man shook his hand and drove away, the truck running smooth and quiet. That evening, Walter and June sat on the porch. She had her knitting in her lap, a blanket she was making for Ruth's great-granddaughter. He had Emmett's pocket watch in his hand, turning it over between his fingers, feeling the smooth brass case and the steady tick inside. The sun was going down over the fields. The light came in low and gold, the way it did on summer evenings in Iowa, stretching the shadows of the fence posts long and thin across the grass. "Danny called again today," June said. "I know. He told me he's coming next weekend. He sounded different this time. Nervous. That's a good sign. Means he cares enough to be nervous." June smiled and went back to her knitting. A cardinal landed on the porch railings, sat there for a moment, and flew off again. "You miss it?" June asked. She meant the tractor. She always knew what he was thinking. Walter looked at the barn. The door was open, and he could see the empty corner where the machine had sat for longer than anyone alive could remember. The concrete was lighter there, a clean rectangle where dust had never settled. I miss what it meant, he said. Having something of Emmett's. Something he touched every day. He held up the pocket watch. But it did what it was supposed to do. Emmett brought it home and it waited. 100 years it waited. And then when we needed it most, it was there. He'd understand. He'd say it was the best use that tractor ever had. June reached over and put her hand on his arm. He'd say, "You did good, Walter. I didn't do anything. Clara found it. The experts confirmed it. The auction house sold it." "You kept it?" June said. "Every dealer in the county told you it was worthless, and you brought it home and put it back in the barn. You could have taken the $300. You didn't." Walter was quiet for a moment. "She was right, and they both knew it. I just couldn't sell it for scrap," he said. "It wasn't mine to give away for nothing. It was Emmett's." The sun touched the horizon and the light turned amber. Fireflies drifted up from the grass, blinking slow and steady in the warm air. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Walter looked at the watch in his hand. The second hand moved in its small, precise circle, the way it had been moving since Emmett wound it for the first time. Still ticking, still keeping time, still doing what it was made to do. He put the watch back in his pocket and reached for June's hand. "Let's go inside," he said. "I'll make dinner." "You can't cook, Walter." "I can make eggs." "You can burn eggs. Then you'll supervise." June laughed. It was a real laugh, full and warm, and it carried across the porch and into the yard and out over the fields where Emmett had plowed the first furrows with a machine everyone else called scrap. Walter helped her up from the chair. She leaned on his arm, steadier than she'd been in months, and they walked together through the screen door into the kitchen where the light was on, and dinner was waiting to be made. Behind them, the sun finished setting. The fields went dark. The barn stood quiet and empty against the sky, and the pocket watch in Walter's pocket kept ticking, keeping time for whatever came next.